Hi guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam, and the title of today's short talk is How Magic Exposed, or Once Exposed, Cannot Be Believed. I think we can all relate to how magic tricks can really dazzle us until we see the trick behind the apparent magic, at which point, for one thing, we're no longer impressed at all, but also we can't unsee it anymore. So it kind of loses its entire appeal. And the analogy is quite apt for how we deal with the sense of self, and also especially how we deal with problems. So I had a session today with someone who's dealing with a problem, and it's quite a clear-cut and well-defined problem. And we were about to set into a bit of an introspective exploration of the emotions behind that situation and so on. But before we did, I thought to take a step back and explain how a problem is never really solved. I'm going to take an extra step back here in this video and make a separation between solving something on a practical level and solving something on an emotional level, and how it is very handy to separate those two. So you can solve things on a practical level, there's no doubt about it. On an emotional level, whether you solve it, attack it, or avoid it, you may still remain internally unresolved about the situation. And the reason, or the way rather, that you can confirm this is if a similar situation arises in the future, you will be equally triggered yet again, right? So that distinction is, I think, worthwhile. And then we come to this notion that a problem can never really be solved when we're talking about that emotional angle, or the emotional bite that a problem might carry for you. That in order for real transformation to happen, we must come first to an intellectual and eventually to a really an alchemical transformation. But first comes an intellectual understanding that you can only ever really disabuse yourself of seeing a situation as a problem, or conveying reality to a problem. Right? So we convey a certain sense of validity to a problem, and a big element in why we do that, what makes a problem seem real, is that there is an external and conscious element to the problem. There is the situation that we can observe, or the person against which we are, fighting or whatever, or trying to avoid. There is our thinking about the problem, right? And there may be even some conscious emotions about the problem. And that is everything that is living above ground. And by that I mean it is visible to us, and it is visible to our conscious awareness. However, there are two elements which might be working against us. One of them is how the narrative about the problem, the external perceptions that we see about the problem, our thinking, even the way we visualize the problem in our head, the emotions, and if we've done a little bit of somatics, the bodily sensations around the problem are all mushed up. They are, you could say they create a kind of fabric. I like to use the analogy of how they create a fabric, right? So we like to think of a fabric as a thing, but upon close inspection, we see that it is made of little strands and threads that are woven together, right? Now, whilst they are woven together, that fabric is, it contains this tensegrity to it. It's difficult to rip apart. Small funny parenthesis, since I'm a movie file, I've always been impressed or puzzled in movies at how when somebody is injured, somebody else will rip a shirt. And I'm like, I couldn't rip a shirt if my life depended on it, right? So I always think it's funny how they just rip things apart in movies that way. Anyway, I digress. So a fabric has a kind of integrity to it because of the wovenness of the strands and the little strings that make for it. And as I said, we tend to think of a fabric as a thing. But if we look at it a little bit closer, we can start to see the strands, and we can start to pull away at them. And if we separate all the strands, then it is child's play to rip it apart, right? You can tear it apart very, very easily. And the same applies to a problem. The different strands that make the experience tend to be tightly knit and woven together in a way in which the problem seems to be a monolithic single experience. Now, the experience is unitary for sure. In other words, it doesn't contain separate parts, but it does contain separate aspects. And we can distinguish those separate aspects and clarify them so that we can start to see the different strands that make up what seems to be otherwise a single phenomenon, or a phenomenon containing one element, which is called problematic, right? In order to illustrate this in a way that might help, you could take, this little card holder here. Now, the card holder is an undivided unit. And yet, I am able to speak about its texture, I'm able to speak about its shape, and I'm able to speak about its color, for example, right? And those are aspects of a unit. I can distinguish the aspects and still acknowledge that the experience of the card holder is a unitary experience, a unified experience. Now, we could do the same with a problem. Part of what I teach to help people transcend problems, like I said, not solve, but transcend problems, or disabuse ourselves of their reality, is to be able to distinguish the different experiential aspects of the experience. And the other element that might be acting against us is the notion that there is a conscious part of the experience and there is a subconscious part of the experience. The conscious part of the experience is going to be what we see, who we see, how they make us feel, what we think about them, everything that we can discern, actively discern and perceive. Even if it's kind of all mushed up together, you can still perceive it. And there's going to be a hidden prong to the entire experience, and that is the subconscious part of it. That part requires skill and work to tease out. And it is going to be essentially made of fear, right? And it is going to be made of fear of acknowledging something about ourselves that is too scary to acknowledge. And I can give a couple of examples of what those could be. So you could be, for example, dealing with a bully at work. And you'll either be, sort of fighting back and standing your ground, or you'll be avoiding this person altogether. But regardless of the action that you're taking, or what you think about the person, subconsciously, what you feel in your heart of hearts is a fear of potentially, I'm just making this entire thing up, but just as an example, you could feel the fear of simply acknowledging how scared you feel about having a heart-to-heart conversation and stating how you feel, because it'll be dismissed and you'll be minimized, or you name it, right? And that'll take you back to whenever that happened at 4 years of age or so. So you'll avoid it. You'll instead act out or weasel out of interacting with this person. So the ability to respond in a calibrated way, it won't be available to you. You'll either be too yin or too yang, and it'll be uncalibrated and unskillful. You could, for example, be trying to, I don't know, start a business, for example, and you keep coming across procrastination, and then you come to realize that you're afraid to succeed because you believe it'll take you, it'll make you feel lonely and separated from the people that you love. Things of that kind always play up in the mind. But see, we tend to project the problem and the cause of the problem, the root cause of the problem, to the external situation or to our behavior in response to it, whilst all along there is a subconscious, unacknowledged fear that we are repressing for protection purposes. And our task is to bring that subconscious fear to the foreground along with the rest of the situation, that we may deal with the entirety of the situation that we call a problem, and come to see that the real problem, or the real reason why the situation is triggering and problematic, as opposed to just inconvenient or uncomfortable, is the unacknowledged fear and the parts that we've repressed about ourselves and that we have disowned about ourselves. That's the real problem. That's the problem every single time, as a matter of fact. Now, we go back to how magic once exposed cannot be believed. And see, the thing is, once you have disentangled the different aspects of the experience of a problem, and once you have brought to the foreground things that were pulling the strings in the background, you have engaged in a clarification exercise. You have not tried to solve the problem externally, although, once again, and I said that at the beginning, on a practical level you might have, and probably it's a good idea to do so. But the question is, how effective will you be at doing it? And have you actually solved it fundamentally, or have you only solved it practically, right? And what you want to do is really engage on a clarification exercise, disentangling the elements of the problem and bringing to the foreground the fundamental fear that has been disowned, that it may be felt and acknowledged and experienced for as long as it takes, and it might be quite a long time, actually. There may be a lot of energy there that needs to be felt. And once this is done, it is literally impossible to see the problem the same way. Now, it may take a while so that it no longer feels like a problem. Okay, so that's fair to mention. This is not a magic, magic is not on offer here, right? This is the video talks about magic. This is not a magical cure or a magical solution, nor will it preclude or rather save us from having to face the problem. But it points towards clarification as the real tool that does the job. And it points towards an internal facing and resolution where it really matters and where it really happens, that we may be able to then face externally and resolve things externally, either by having a difficult conversation, a heart-to-heart conversation, avoiding this person altogether, or God forbid, even getting into a fight, right? Like all options are open, and one or the other might be the calibrated, appropriate response, provided that the situation requires it. But we will have the appropriate response only when we have become acquainted with and resolve the internal fear that had been disowned about that particular situation. And once we do this, as I said, we have essentially seen through it, and therefore we can transcend it. Nothing that is unclear can be transcended. You can only, or we can only, transcend things that have been utterly clarified to the nth degree, that we may be completely at peace with every part of ourselves, and that then translates into different thinking, different emotions, and in turn different courses of action about things. There is one last element in all this, and that is that the problem tends to feel very personal, and we also are going to enter into a dance in which the sense of self that arises out of the problem is an integral part of the problem. So we were just mentioning disentangling a fabric. So we had thoughts, we had emotions, we had physical sensations, we had what we can experience from the outside world, and then we have the sense of self. And the sense of self is a tricky little element, because the sense of self is, in essence, the mechanism that preserves the repression of what is subconsciously not seen about the problem. That is essentially what it is. So it's a kind of pivot between the conscious and the subconscious, and if we're onto it, if we take it into account and allow it to also be part of what's perceived, in other words, treat it just as another sense, we stand a chance of entering into a dialogue or an investigative view of that which we can't yet see, because it's obscured by our sense of self. And the sense of self will use all kinds of little strategies like indignation or, shame or whatever. But really, its job is just to not let you see and notice and acknowledge the fact that really what you are is afraid. Yeah. And so it's a protector, but it's also an obscuration veil that doesn't allow us to do this work that easily, of course. So the essence of today's video is about how our job when it comes to dealing with quote unquote problems is not one of solving, but one of clarifying, and how once we have clarified the conscious elements of the problem, and once we have brought to the conscious the unconscious element of the problem, we are in a position to then dance with this, feel what needs to be felt, and in doing that, we disabuse ourselves of the notion that we are dealing with a problem to begin with. And that is, in essence, what today's video is about. So there you have it. Very curious, as usual, what you guys make of the topic. And if you think that these talks are handy, then your liking, sharing, and subscribing makes the channel more visible out there. Thanks for watching so far. I'll be back with more videos pretty soon. Cheerio.